The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Here's a shocking fact. If you add up all the household debt in Canada, it's more than our annual gross domestic product. Tonight, we'll find out what's fueling that and why that could put everyone in a tricky situation. Then, from craft brewing in the province to what shapes generational differences, we've got the Agenda's Weekend Review. It's Friday, June 9th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Earlier this week, the Bank of Canada raised interest rates again. That'll be unpleasant news to households across the country. It's also a red flag because Canadians collectively carry the most debt of any G7 country. That was not always the case, and actually household debt has been declining elsewhere. Let's get a sense of what's happening and why it's everyone's business from, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. And in Ottawa, Mike Moffat, Senior Director at the Smart Prosperity think tank and Assistant Professor at Western University's Ivey Business School. Hi to you both.
Hello, Nam.
Hello.
So lots of news about the interest rate. We're going to get to that in a minute. But Jim, can you give us a definition of what household debt is?
Well, household debt, you just add up, Nam, all the money you owe to other people and see how big it is at the bottom line. Obviously, the biggest part of that in Canada is mortgage debt that people have taken on to help buy a house, $2.1 trillion of mortgage debt. Then on top of that, you can add your credit card bills, your new car loans, your student loans, maybe even a little bit you owe to the loan shark down the street. Who knows? Total household debt in Canada, $2.8 trillion, trillion with a T.
Wow, that is a big number. I'm getting stressed just hearing you list everything off because I'm like, check, check, check. But before we talk about how it's impacting Canadians, I thought we could talk about how we compare to other countries when it comes to household debt. Here's a chart showing debt as share of GDP, comparing 2010 to 2021 in the G7 countries. The blue bars are from 2010, and the red bars are from 2021. Right off the bat, numbers for Italy have stayed almost the same and are the lowest in the G7. 2010, it was 43, and in 2021, a slight increase to 44. Next, the UK and US are almost the same in 2010 at 94, UK, and US at 92. The numbers for debt drops for both countries in 2021, for the US to 78 and the UK to 86%. However, when we looked at Canada, it was nearly the same with the UK at 95 in 2010, but in 2021 rose to an astounding 107%. Mike, in 2010, as we noticed there, household debt in Canada was 95% of the GDP, and in 2021 it was 107%. Does this concern you?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason is that housing explains everything. That you look at which countries have high levels of debt. They're countries like Canada, like the UK. Australia is not on here, but they've got one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world. So absolutely, that why Canadians are going into so much debt is because home prices are so high, and it's kind of forcing them to do so. And in fact, they tend to be the lucky ones because they're actually allowed to do it. We have a lot of people who can't get any housing at all because they're just not eligible to get that debt.
But also renters are in a precarious situation because their rent are going up, and significantly, I'm assuming in those households, housing is the biggest chunk of money. How important is it to differentiate that it is housing that's taking up so much household debt instead of people just maybe going to the mall and spending frivolously? Mike?
Well, I think it is important because you do get an asset out of it at the end of the day, right? This is not something you're going out and ordering some pizzas and putting that in your credit card. That this is an asset. But it causes households to basically have all of their eggs in one basket. That so much of their financial portfolio is wrapped up in a single asset. So here in Ottawa, for instance, most of my household net worth is tied up into my home. And that can be a very dangerous thing. And we saw this here in Ottawa 20 years ago, that when Nortel imploded, not only did the local economy not do that well, but we had a house price crash. So it's causing Canadians to have very undiversified financial portfolios. And again, those are the lucky ones who aren't stuck renting or worse.
Jim, both you and Mike have mentioned that housing is a huge chunk of household debt. Is there another reason why Canadians have so much debt?
Well, we've been measuring debt, Nam, relative to our GDP as a country, or it's often also measured relative to the disposable income of Canadian households. That's an even scarier number if we want to get grim about it. About 180% of disposable income. In other words, Canadians owe about 1.8 times more than their annual after-tax income, which is also very high compared to other countries. Remember, those are ratios. So here's some basic math. A ratio has a numerator and a denominator. The numerator on top of the fraction is the debt, but the denominator is also relevant here. That is to say, how is our GDP growing? Or for households, they don't really care about GDP. It's their actual own income that is growing. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the stagnation of real incomes for Canadians over the last generation, we have not seen very strong wage growth relative to inflation. In fact, during the current inflation, we've seen wage growth going backwards relative to inflation. So that, again, escalates the relative size of that debt compared to our incomes and our ability to service that debt.
Mike, when this much money is wrapped up in household debt, how does that impact the broader economy?
Well, it certainly adds risk, particularly when interest rates change. So again, I'm going to use personal examples from my own life, that a lot of my financial net worth is wrapped up in the home that I'm currently in. And my mortgage renews in August, and it's going to be a much higher rate than it was 5 years ago. So what that means for folks like me, as that mortgage renews, that's a lot of money coming out of our pockets that's going somewhere else. Now, for folks like me, that's just kind of a frustrating thing, something I can live with, maybe fewer vacations. But for those who are precariously housed or, 1 or 2 paychecks away from insolvency, that causes real financial hardships for them.
Jim, I want to pose that same question to you.
Yeah, we have seen this huge run-up in interest rates led by the Bank of Canada starting a little over a year ago. They are jacking up rates because that's how they think is the best way to get inflation out of the system. But for households that do have debt, this is going to be punishing. And we are seeing it already in the total debt service charges that households are paying. They have grown by about $40 billion at an annual rate a year since the Bank of Canada started raising rates. So that means $40 billion a year, close to 2% of our GDP, that households are no longer spending on food, clothing, and shelter. It's actually money that flows straight to the banks. And, right now the banks obviously are appreciating that, although they have to weigh that against the risk of bankruptcies and loan losses, which could be around the corner. But from the economy's perspective, this is just a drain on the purchasing power of Canadians. And it's one of the reasons that our economy is slowing down and is going to slow down some more in the months ahead.
Jim, I have to follow up on a few things that you said. You said that the Bank of Canada is increasing the interest rate because that's, quote, how they think, and it's punishing households. Can you expand on that? How is it punishing households? Well, is there another way to take? Is there another avenue to take to
control inflation? Mm-hmm. Sure. I think we do need a more diversified strategy for controlling inflation. The textbook theory, really written back after the inflationary episodes of the 1970s and 1980s, the textbook theory is the central bank should target a certain number for the inflation rate. In Canada, they've picked 2% as the magic number, and then use the interest rate, the big hammer, if you like, in their toolbox, to try and get inflation to that level. And the underlying assumption is that inflation is always caused by too much spending power in the economy. Therefore, higher interest rates, by draining off that spending power, will solve the problem. In the wake of the pandemic, though, those textbook models really had to be reconsidered, if not thrown right out. This inflation that we're experiencing clearly resulted from supply shocks and global disruptions, consumer desperation after months of lockdowns, pent-up demand, and an energy price shock. None of those things had to do with Canadians having too much spending power. So I think that the bank's approach to controlling inflation has been too narrow. Think of it this way, Nam. If you have a toolbox and the only thing in that toolbox is a great big hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. And that's kind of what the Bank of Canada is doing here. Whatever the causes of inflation, we're going to hammer it with this interest rate hammer. And I don't think it's the most effective way to control inflation, this type of inflation. And it is certainly causing a lot of distress for households who are going to have to find several $100s or even over $1,000 a month to pay for those extra interest charges.
Mike, I want to follow up with you because I see you and I think, keep the same, we wake up very early. I see you on Twitter talking about this, because sometimes I think when it comes to this stuff, it's just dollars and cents, but on the ground, it's impacting Canadians' lives in a real way. We know that more Canadians are using food banks than ever. There's a cost of living crisis. When the interest rates go up, why is it important for us to think about how it's impacting Canadians directly instead of kind of having this bigger picture about getting things in control?
Yeah, well, it's certainly, we can't forget the human side of it, because Jim is absolutely right. Like, that's the sort of textbook definition of how you drive down inflation is that you damp down consumer spending, and you do so by taking money out of the pockets of consumers because they're paying that in higher interest rates. But it's one thing if it's that money is coming out of high income people's wallets. It's another thing when you've got people who are precariously housed in difficult situations. That money that you're taking out of their pocket is the money that they're using to go buy groceries or go buy clothes for their kids. So what ends up happening is you get people displaced from their homes. You get more people using food banks. We've seen across Canada, but particularly in the GTA, exceptionally long food bank lines. So we can never remember that or never forget that humans are at the end of this. And when we're using monetary policy to take money out of their pockets, it forces people to make some very difficult decisions.
I want to go back to that chart that I showed earlier just to compare how Canada is doing in comparison to other countries. Jim, Italy and Germany have the lowest 2021 household debt in the G7. What makes them so different from Canada?
Well, the housing market situation is very different in those two countries than in Canada. So Mike pointed out from the beginning, housing is the big story here. In Germany and Italy, a couple of things. Number one, there's a lot more people who rent in those countries than in Canada, and they've got, in a way, more protection for renters. A common practice in Germany is you would rent a house or an apartment, and you would live there basically for your whole adult life. You've got rights as a renter. You can't be kicked out, and there's limits on how much the landlord can raise your rent. So in that type of situation that's more renter-friendly, you don't have the same compulsion that you must buy your own home, as I think most Canadians feel, at least those who can afford it. Another factor would be, I think, that there's tighter controls on access to credit in terms of creditworthiness standards and some of the regulations regarding household lending and mortgage lending in particular. So in Canada, we've got a very liberalized banking system. And when interest rates were low, as they were through most of the period covered by this graph, first of all, credit looks cheap and in the short term for households. Secondly, banks have got an enormous incentive to basically load up customers with as much debt as the rules allow. And our rules, even though we do have stress tests and so on, the banks are supposed to look at households' ability to repay debt even at higher interest rates. In practice, honestly, there's been very little limit on how much banks can pump into household debt. And that has, in fact, fueled the housing bubble. The housing bubble could not have grown so much in Canada without this constant inflow of cheap credit. It's been very different in some of those other countries, which is why both housing prices are not as outrageous as they are in Canada, and household debt, as a result, is much more moderate.
We've been talking about this bubble, I think, for almost 2 decades now in Canada. The US and the UK have almost as high household debt as Canada, but at least theirs is going down instead of up. Canada's household debt, I think we've been talking about it for over 10 years. Mike, why is this problem so persistent in this country?
Well, I think it's, again, it all mostly goes back to housing, that, our population is growing and our housing stock isn't. And one of the ways I think we can think of household debt is being a function of a lack of options. So in the housing market, what that means is, there's not that many houses to buy, not that many houses to rent. So that forces people into these difficult situations where they're having to buy very expensive homes and go into a lot of debt. But we can also think a lack of options when it comes to things like transit. That we look at Italy and Germany, one thing that they have is very good transit, not just within cities, but between cities. So what that means is you don't necessarily have to buy a car or a second car. So you don't have to go into debt that way. So by giving people more options, it allows them to not necessarily take on debt if they don't have to. And unfortunately, in Canada, we've created this situation where there's not a lot of housing options. There's not a lot of transit options, kind of forcing people into cars and so on. So families have no choice but to take on large amounts of debt, even if they're not comfortable with it.
Jim, is it inevitable that Canadians are kind of being forced to go into household debt?
Oh, it's not inevitable at all. It clearly reflects structural forces and policy choices that we have made about how we're going to organize our housing system. We have relied very much on private home ownership as the dominant form of living arrangements in Canada. We've also, as Mike was just noting, relied on kind of extensive development of suburbs and single-family homes rather than more intensive urban developments, which are also common obviously in places like Germany and Italy. And we have really in Canada, I think a big part of the problem, stepped back from the provision of any other kind of housing arrangements. So what I might call non-market housing, if you like, where you're not just not buying the house yourself and you're not renting it from a landlord who's treating the house as an investment asset. In both cases, the value of having a roof over your head gets all mixed up with the idea that, this is your most important financial asset. And that financialization, if you like, of housing is part of the problem. And we used to do things like housing co-ops, for example, or community housing trusts, or social housing, nonprofit housing of different kinds that break that link between the roof over your head and some kind of financial bet that people have to place on the value of their home, and hoping that their home will be their retirement plan in essence. And as Mike said, it is really, really wrong to think that you're going to fund your whole retirement with one asset. Okay, that just it's way too risky. So I think that part of the long run solution is going to be, as Mike says, to provide more choices to people, including the ability to just pay for a roof over your head at a fair rate, a secure rate, a sustainable rate, where you've got rights as a tenant, but it doesn't require you to place this huge financial bet. And the banks won't like that, because the banks make a fortune from the mortgage lending business that they run. But I think it's got to be an important part of solving this for Canadians in the long run.
Mike, you described the options that we have towards transit and housing as a function of a lack of options. When we talk about solutions, a solution that's been mentioned many, many times over the years is for Canada to build more housing. I don't want to yell this question, but I feel like I should yell this question. Why is Canada so bad at building homes?
Oh, it's any number of reasons. So first of it is municipal zoning and approvals process, or things like that. That we have set up a system that prevents anything from anything other than McMansions being built to high rises. So, for example, in most cities, I could take a small wartime bungalow, tear it down, and build a McMansion, and nobody could stop me. But if I wanted to build an affordable 3 or 4 unit triplex or quadplex, I can't do that without going through a lot of zoning and approvals process. So the whole system is designed to actually limit housing choices. Some of it is tax policy. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, we had very generous tax incentives in place to build purpose-built rentals. Those have gone away. I think we need to look at those again. And Jim's right that whether it be social housing, co-op housing, all of these non-market options, they've been essentially taken off the table the last 35 to 40 years. We do have a national housing strategy designed to bring some of those back. It's spent a lot of money, hasn't really accomplished much yet, but it's got the sort of right idea that government does need to play a bigger role in the housing market.
Ontario has pledged to build 1.5 million homes in the next decade. And now with the interest rates going up, I wanted to get a sense of both of you. Who is this economy working for? Jim?
Well, in that model, as announced by the Ford government in Ontario, it's working for housing development companies. First of all, they're drooling about all this former greenbelt land that they can build new monster home suburbs, and the profit motive driving the development industry leads them to those types of products because they're much more profitable than building affordable multi-unit homes in urban areas. Secondly, it obviously works for the banks. So again, the profits on the mortgage lending end of the business, as long as they avoid a housing meltdown. One of the interesting points of the graph you showed, Nam, was the decline in the debt ratio in the United States. And, you could look at that and say, well, the debt ratio has gone down since 2010. They've had a great run. But it was an ugly story behind it, which was called the housing meltdown that followed the mortgage lending crisis in that time. So as long as that doesn't happen in Canada, the banks are going to be laughing. And so, again, I think the profit motive has distorted the sort of choices that we make, both in what type of housing we build and how we provide it, and then how we pay for it. And this kind of, chicken and egg thing that's happening. People can't afford a house, so they go into debt. The purchasing power that comes from that debt helps the price go even higher on the housing, and so on and so forth. That relationship is really what's driven the escalating debt ratios in Canada.
And Mike?
So I'm going to say it's basically working for no one. I mean, one of the glib answers would be that, well, it's working for existing homeowners. That you have somebody who bought a house in Toronto in, I don't know, like 1975 for like $50,000, and now it's worth $2 or $3 million. But I'd even suggest it's not working particularly well for them. And one group, interestingly enough, that I talked to, who's most upset about the housing situation is women in their 60s and 70s. Even though they might have bought a house 30 or 40 years ago and done well financially, what it's done is it's caused their kids to have to move out of the GTA and move to places like a Brantford or a Woodstock or so on. And then grandma doesn't get to see the grandkids anymore. So any kind of financial benefit on that side has been replaced with all of these social harms that it's, causing families to move farther apart from each other and things like that. So I suggest that this is working well for nobody, and we really need to reform this system sooner rather than later.
Jim, I'll give you the last minute. What do you say to Canadians who are struggling to make those mortgage payments, the rent payments, the credit card payments?
Well, for their individual perspective, all they can do is try and make ends meet. And Canadians are good at trying to scrounge and cut back on other things and do what they can to pay the necessary bills. So at an individual level, it's hard to know what else to do. At a collective level, we need to rethink how we think of a house. Is it a speculative financial asset, or is it a roof over our heads? And rethink how government has a central role to play in managing a housing system so that people can actually afford a decent home, not to get rich on, but to live a good life in.
Jim, Mike, thank you so much for having this discussion. I know a lot of people are struggling to make ends meet, and this helps us understand the situation a little bit better. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nam.
Thank you.
The agenda this week assessed protections for zoo animals in Ontario, asked how to grow cities with charm, considered whether your generation shapes your media diet, and spoke to author Jean Twenge about the differences among those generations. The agenda's Week in Review begins with Ontario's craft brewing industry.
Okay, JSJ, give me your take on how level the playing field is.
In terms of level, you're not going to find somebody, with a bubble that's going to sit in the middle. It's if you're trying to use a tool for that, it's not going to work. The beer store is a great idea, or at least it was in 1927 when it was a co-op. It's structured as a co-op, and this means that they don't have any capital. What it is a great reducer of complexity. And one of the problems that we're talking about here is the problem of market complexity. You've got all these brands, you want to get them to the consumer. At the time, when it was developed, you didn't have this number of brands. You had, 30 breweries across Ontario in 1930. And then by, 1990, you've got 3 or something like that. It's Molson, Labatt, and Sleeman. And it becomes really difficult once you've got so many different varieties, this trend towards innovation that Mandy's talking about, it becomes really difficult to represent that product across the province. But for Molson and Labatt, who have a smaller number of brands, the beer store is really effective because it allows them to share delivery costs. They're not really operating, and the monopoly question is kind of out the window at this point. They're operating together in order to deliver beer across the province. That's what the beer store is, and they own that distribution.
Okay, Mandy, let me come back at you for sort of finish up this line of questioning here, and that is, there is this so-called master agreement between the Government of Ontario and the beer store, the 3 companies that run the beer store, and that expires in 2 years. If you were able to oversee the transition in a way where something would emerge that would be more friendly to your industry, what would you like to see happen?
I think many other small brewers would like to see the ability, firstly, for brewers to open more of their own retail stores. And so creating that experience where you come in and you look in the tanks and you talk to someone who's knowledgeable about the beer and you can taste the thing that was just packaged this morning, that's really unique to craft beer.
And you can't do that now?
No, so craft brewers are limited to 2 retail stores in the province. Each retail store is required to have an operating brewery. And of course, the investment in stainless steel tanks and all of the machinery required to build a brewery, packaging equipment, that's really cost prohibitive for us to be building multiple breweries. We're limited to 2.
How many do you have?
I have 1, but hopefully by the end of the year I'll have 2. That's the goal. And
but
so,
if you could have, if you didn't have to have brew making capacity at every location, how many locations do you dream of having?
Multiple. I could see having them in different areas of the city. We'd also like to see the ability to cross-sell each other's beer. So imagine a world where craft brewers could start a cooperative like the beer store. We could sell each other's products. We're really passionate about craft beer. We can promote breweries that have similar values to our own. The opportunities would really be endless in a world where craft brewers were granted the same rights that the foreign multinationals have today.
Got it. Okay, we're down to our last few minutes here, and let's just let's finish up on this. I guess it was about 10, 20 years ago, Jordan, the craft brewing industry was all the rage across the province, right? And there were tons of people getting into it, and it looked like there was lots of money being made, and it was certainly the shiny new thing on the shelf. Does that, okay, that was then. What's the level of hype around it today, in your view?
I would say that the level of hype has diminished to some extent. The difficulty being that people are a little bit overwhelmed. You're also facing a demographic challenge in the sense that the boomer generation is aging. They're the people who used to buy 2 fours of beer on the weekends. 1977 is the high point for that, by the way. It's been steadily decreasing since then. So you've got that issue. But you've also got people who just spent 3 years after turning legal to drink not being able to go to pubs. So there's a socialization element in there as well. It becomes a little bit difficult to get people to buy in. If you can imagine walking into the LCBO for your first time as a 19-year-old and seeing this amount of variety, well, maybe it's a panoply of wonderful choices, and maybe it's just a little overwhelming. There might be a reason why they're just going for the thing that's cranberry flavored in the seltzer aisle. Being able to tell the story is really important, and I think more locations for bottle shops for breweries would help with that.
Okay, Steve, let me try from this angle here. We've heard about the challenges you guys have in terms of how many locations you're allowed to have. Taxation policy is a problem. You feel there's an uneven playing field as it relates to distribution. How much is the industry itself, though, to blame for whatever problems it is having right now, in your view?
Oh, it's hard to blame an industry, right? Because it's not like we did this to ourselves. It happened. I think you put a lot of enthusiasm into any market, and it's going to expand. And there was so much enthusiasm for craft beer for so long that it expanded really fast. Again, those of us that have been in the industry long enough remember that this isn't the first time that craft beer had a downturn. Back in '95, everyone was claiming craft beer was dead, and it came back with a vengeance. I feel like it'll come back again. We just have to kind of be okay with the fact that we're not the only thing in beverage alcohol that people are talking about today. But we're still an important part of the industry, and I think craft beer has a bright future ahead of it still.
Graham, if you could make one change to the way things work right now, what would you do?
I really agree with the ability to cross-sell with other and collaborate with other small producers and small breweries across the province would be a big change and game changer for us, particularly in the north, because of existing distribution challenges we have now.
Okay. Mandy, how about you? One big change that you think would really improve things?
It's really tough for me to make a pick between tax reform, like I talked about some of those tax challenges earlier, and giving craft beer fans access to more craft beer through more craft beer purchase locations. If I had to choose one over the other, I think really for the sustainability of the industry, we really need to see some major changes on the tax side for small brewers, and make sure that our pace of tax growth is not many multiples larger than that of the large brewers.
JSJ, what say you?
Well, for me, I think that one of the things that's going to happen is if you open up more grocery stores after the MFA is renegotiated or possibly scrapped entirely.
This is the Master Frame Agreement?
That's right. They're currently at 450 grocery stores. They topped out 6 years into the agreement. You could expand that easily. And in fact, the LCBO has been expanding into more convenience outlets, about 130 over the last year. Nobody seems to mention that part. We already are having convenience store sales. It's just not the way you want it to be. So more shelf space will definitely help. But if we had more independent retailers who were able to sell craft beer without the decision-making process that goes into a large chain like Loblaws or a Sobeys, something like that, you might end up with better results.
Gotcha.
There's definitely a spectrum of zoos out there, with the Toronto Zoo being, one of our top zoos in Canada, there's a variety of different places. But roadside zoos are typically those hobby zoo that is on the side of a highway, which is why they're called roadside zoos in a rural town, with people who don't have expertise or any training in how to take care of these animals, versus a more established, professionally accredited zoo, which has training and staff and a business plan, and our other guest, Dolph, will tell you more. All right. Well, Kendra, I'm hoping you give us a sense here. Do we know how many roadside zoos are in Ontario? Do we have a figure on that?
I certainly know we have the most in the country. What's the specific number? I think it fluctuates a little bit, depending, 40, 50, something like that, I would say. Yeah. It's our estimate. All right. Kendra, one of the things I had mentioned a few animals off the top, and I think when people think of roadside zoos, one of the things we think about is big cats. And I'm curious, do we know how many big cats there are in the province right now? It's extremely hard to track. Organizations like World Animal Protection have done their best to try to establish some firm numbers. It's probably higher even than we think. It's precisely as Melissa said, this is really unregulated. It could be talking about someone having some in their backyard or on their property, and then of course we get into the private zoos. So getting a firm number is tough. What ballpark-wise? Hundreds of big cats, lions, tigers, jaguars. But again, as Kendra said, there's no public reporting of this, which is a serious problem for whether it's an emergency responder or a municipal bylaw enforcement officer not knowing what they're going to come across on someone's property. Oh. All right. Kendra, I want to ask you, a lot of people might be surprised that there are lions, jaguars, tigers in this province right now amongst us. I'm curious, what specific animals are banned in Ontario? Are there animals that are banned? It's interesting. In Ontario, it's actually only illegal to have two kinds of animals, pit bulls or orcas. So in contrast to a province like British Columbia, for example, which has pages of animals that have been deemed not appropriate for people to keep or private businesses to keep because we're not able to offer anywhere near the level of even basic welfare standards for them. Ontario is a bit of a Wild West, pardon the pun,
right.
When it comes to which animals are allowed here. And most of it is left to municipalities. And some research assistants and I actually dug into the numbers across all of Ontario's 444 municipalities, and a full half of them didn't have any regulations governing the keeping of wild animals. So that's huge areas of the province. Obviously an area where we could do with some provincial leadership.
All right, we'll get into that. I want to bring Dolph into the conversation. Dolph, of course, you're at the helm of a publicly funded zoo, the Toronto Zoo. There's another component to what your organization does that I think the public maybe not aware of. Talk to us a little bit about the Saving Species Sanctuary. What is it exactly?
Yeah, this is an important addition that came through our master planning process a year ago. And, you know, as we went out to the public, we talked about our mission of connecting people, animals, and conservation science to fight extinction. One of the things they're looking for good accredited zoos to do is be a home for those animals that could be in harm's way. And you know, kicking off the show with the number of lions, tigers, when we get into large reptiles, venomous snakes, it is really troubling that there's so many of these animals out there. We're not sure where they are, and we have such limited capacity to care for them if they are abandoned or in a scenario where that passionate person passes away or who knows what. So we added this to our master plan in response to public feedback and to address the gap that really clearly exists here of not knowing what's out there and what happens to it if they end up in harm's way.
All right, Kendra, I'm going to come to you. Recently, Melissa's organization, World Animal Protection, asked Ontarians to not visit private roadside zoos. I just want to get your take. Do you agree on that strategy?
Yes. If you want entertainment, you go see the film Blackberry. If you want to learn about animals, which I think a lot of people do, you read books, you watch documentaries. Perhaps you volunteer at your local humane society or for your local wildlife rehabilitator. Right? Roadside zoos, I think people frequent them for a range of different reasons. Sometimes I think there is that genuine curiosity and interest in animals that comes from a very laudable place, a good place. But sometimes I think most of us would agree that it's just the novelty or you know, the entertainment factor. And the reality is that we need to move away from this idea of thinking of animals as objects to be put on display, objects that we can be making money from, or the people who run these organizations can be making money from.
All right, Melissa, let's talk Queen's Park. What is Queen's Park not doing about roadside zoos that you would like them to do?
We would like to see them set up a comprehensive, proactive licensing system so that if you want to have a zoo, you need to have the professional expertise and qualifications in order to care for those animals, that you have a business plan, an emergency plan, that you have the proper resources. Because right now, we have some standards, but it's a Band-Aid. We're seeing charges being laid and then, you know, courts are being backlogged, so we don't even know if there's a success for a conviction. We've seen that with Marineland a few times. And there's nothing to curb this problem. We have more roadside zoos than any other jurisdiction in Canada. So it's a massive animal welfare problem and public safety problem. So we need a proactive system of licensing. And really, if those zoos can't keep their animals to a professional standard, they should be closed down in a pragmatic way.
Now, is this a little bit different than, we do have some standards. There's the Ontario Standard for Care, which is, you know, food, shelter, water. Are we asking to double down on that, or is this something completely different?
I think the standards that exist could be strengthened. We were at the advisory table providing input in those standards. That was back, they were adopted, I think, in 2008, 2009. So it wasn't everything we asked for, but it's something. But it's also about enforcement. So we released a report last September reviewing 11 zoos in Ontario. All of those zoos had issues where there was potential violations of existing standards. So even those minimum standards were being violated.
Mary, start us with this. Can you define what the charm or character of a city is?
No, you really can't. And I just want to make sure right off the top that we talk honestly about that, because charm is in the eye of the beholder. And I always worry, and I'm sure that my esteemed colleague to my left and I are going to have an animated conversation about this, because there are lots of parts of cities that locals would probably not use the term charm, but they would say it's theirs. It reflects who they are. It's come up as a result of whatever needs and aspirations they had. And so it has a kind of local charm. But what I want us to do is be careful to not sound condescending and judgmental. That's charming, that isn't. It's really got to be about authenticity and resonance with the local community. And,
Okay.
and I think you can do that.
Okay, Mr. Condescending and judgmental. Let's hear from you on this. I don't know if that was meant for him.
I handed
but
it right over to
Yeah,
you.
you kind of did.
It's
kinda
true.
did.
What can I say?
What do you feel you can define the charm or character of a city when you see it?
Well, I know if I feel the city is charming or not. And to be honest with you, Steve, I've never thought charm is Toronto's long suit. I mean, we have charming areas. They're charming neighborhoods. Cabbagetown is charming. The area around Roncesvalles is very charming. Yonge and Eglinton, this area that we're in right now, where I grew up, is very uncharming. But
12 years of LRT construction will do that to you.
You know, I think that Yonge and Eglinton is now the sort of metaphor for the whole city. It's a city of constant construction. It's like 1984. Instead of constant war, it's constant construction. These pretentious, over-designed condo towers, and behind it, acres and acres of low-rise, two-story, post-war housing that somehow manages to survive despite it all. But charming is not a word I would use to describe Toronto. It's livable, and we like it, and we're all here. But charming, no.
Well, he gave a couple of examples of neighborhoods in the city that he thinks are charming. Do you want to add to that? When you see charm, what do you think of in this city?
Again, I think it depends on what people are looking for. You know, for me, part of what makes a city really interesting is uniqueness. So, and sometimes I would call that, in my case, I like grit. I like neighborhoods that have mixed use, different kinds of forms, different kinds of design that's been put into there, not in a quite so tidy and thoughtful a way. Sometimes I worry, Chris, with charm, that we're talking about a postcard-like, you know, kind of emblematic, this is a perfect city, versus you and I know, Toronto has all sorts of neighborhoods that are interesting, lots of surprises, and unique to those neighborhoods. And so whether maybe charm is just too sentimental a word, I'm trying to find a word that's more descriptive of forward-thinking, responsive to what people want.
You know, if we go to Paris, let's say, people would say Paris is a charming city. It's more than charming, perhaps it's harmonious. There are very strict rules about how tall a building can be, the materials that they have to be included in the building, that sort of thing, the uses even of the floors. And it adds up to a sense of harmony and sort of, you feel comfortable there because you know.
But they also have a lot of French people speaking French, which adds to the charm, right?
But can I counter this and just say, let's take another city if we're going to do that, Washington, D.C. Lots of harmony in terms of the public buildings. But the really interesting parts of Washington, D.C., as you and I know, are the neighborhoods that have sparked up and are completely idiosyncratic and not sort of charming, but really interesting.
But you know, I guess the thing is that cities have their public areas and their sort of private areas. And when we think about Toronto, we don't think about the neighborhood that I live in or necessarily Cabbagetown, those kinds of places that I mentioned, even though it's charming. We think about what's happening at King and Yonge. We think about what's happening on Bloor Street. We think about, you know, where the baseball stadium is. Those parts of the city that belong to everybody, not necessarily just the people who own or who live in houses.
Okay,
there.
follow up on that then. When you think about what's happening at Yonge and King or at Yonge and Egg or near the Sky Dome or whatever, Rogers Center, whatever, when you think about that, what are you thinking about or referring to?
You know, you just touched on one of the points I want to make, which is I believe that the city is under such pressure to change. The pace of change is so fast that I should say not nobody, but we feel an increasing sense of alienation. We feel untethered. And when you just mentioned Sky Dome, the names of public buildings is another example of that. It started as Sky Dome, then it became something else, and now it's Rogers Center. The O'Keefe Center became Hummingbird, and I don't even know what it is right now. Everything is up for sale. Everything is up for grabs. You know, they're going to move Ontario Place now. They're going to, you know.
Even the Leafs don't play in Maple Leaf Gardens anymore.
Exactly.
Or in a place named Maple Leaf something.
It's a supermarket.
I know, we sound like a couple of fogies here. Sue Ann, how have your media habits changed since it started?
Well, we still get one newspaper, I won't say which one. I get two others, two Americans, plus The Guardian online. I read way more online than I used to. And also, I find that TV news is a bit slow for me with the set format. So more and more I'm getting that online too, so that I can skip some stories.
Huh, so you don't actually watch very much news on television anymore?
It's on all the time. My husband is addicted, but I'm finding it a slow and inefficient way of getting news. Current affairs is different, but not news.
Interesting. Okay. How have your media habits changed with time?
Yeah, I think starting off more with reading the newspaper and then gradually moving into the internet. So even with the internet, it's using more so news websites and then a combination of various social media to get my information.
Do you get a newspaper delivered to your home?
No, I don't.
No kidding. I was kind of, it was a facetious question in a way.
that.
Yeah. Paolo, how about you?
Well, I completed the transition of my generation from legacy media to digital media. So nowadays I do rely on social media, and I do look at the news and TV with the, let's say, the professor perspective, so to really look at what's going on in the legacy media. But my media diet is more closer now to the generation of my students.
Do you get a newspaper delivered to your home?
I used to when I was a child.
I used to when I was a child.
With my family.
Fabulous. Okay. Hazel, how about you?
I have tried to avoid getting most of my news from social media, even though it is so easy. I would say that lately my habit has changed to getting news from news websites directly and from newsletters direct from journalists, which is a fun feature of the internet nowadays.
Hazel, I'm not even going to ask you if you get a newspaper delivered to your home, because I know what the answer is. I know, she's shaking her head. Here's how, I want to show folks how Hazel does her thing. Okay, what are we going to do here? This is TikTok. Here's what a TikTok creator does. It's a clip of Hazel explaining the individual economics of carbon taxes while playing her favorite game. Okay? Are we with me here? Sheldon, roll it if you would.
We have a carbon tax, right? And the point of the carbon tax is not for the government to make money. The point of the carbon tax, thank you, is to, prevent people from polluting, of course. And so to avoid this having any unnecessary financial burden on just regular people, instead of keeping the money, it's revenue neutral, which just means, that they split it up evenly and send it back to people's bank accounts. So most people will make money off of Canada's carbon tax. It should be called a dividend. Only the biggest polluters will actually lose out on the money. I think that rather than being directly sent to our bank accounts, it should be handed out via money guns so everybody knows what it's for and can't get mad about the carbon tax, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, back to Zelda.
I got to tell you, you are fantastic. That is a tremendous talent you just demonstrated there. Never mind conveying all that information about the carbon tax, but while playing a video game, you were doing it. That's astonishing. You have 120,000 followers and 3.5 million likes on your TikTok account. So let's figure that out. Who are your followers?
I did check it out, and my followers seem to be generally in the 25 to 32 range. Actually, of course, I get plenty of Gen Zs as well. But for TikTok, anyway, my audience skews a little bit older, which I guess means that more than just Gen Z are on TikTok.
And why do you think they follow you?
I think that I try to combine, I guess you just saw, I think I try to combine facts about economics and climate with humor as much as possible because it can be a very dry topic.
And to confirm, you were not reading that stuff that you were saying to camera, correct?
It took quite a few takes.
Yeah, but still, that's a heck of an achievement. Well done. I was deeply impressed when I saw that.
Thank you.
Now, you and your fellow millennials, I know, like to think of yourselves as up-to-date people, au courant as it comes to the news. How important is that aspect of your generation's view of itself?
Yeah, I think it's fairly important. I think we've all grown up in a time where we've lived through some major events, both in the United States and Canada, as well as the COVID pandemic, which we've all kind of survived through for the last few years. So I think our absorption of news has become almost heightened to a perspective. So yeah, it's very important.
What's the major international event of your life?
I would say it would be COVID-19. I think that's
Really?
the major thing, because it had so many impacts to the way that we live and how much our work transformed. Like, for example, I used to be working in person 5 days a week, commuting downtown Toronto, and now I've been working remotely for the last 3 years. So that's a pretty major impact on my life personally.
What year were you born?
1990.
So you were 11 for 9/11.
Yes, I was.
Which is a fairly impressionable age. And
It is.
So not 9/11 though.
Not 9/11, just because I was younger when that happened. So the direct impacts to me were less, whereas now in my life, the impact that COVID-19 has had, I think, is more palpable on a daily basis for me.
Okay. Paolo, among many things, you are a Marshall McLuhan Scholar. And McLuhan, as we said in the intro, coined that famous phrase, the medium is the message. How do you think that expression applies to what we're talking about here?
Well, to put it simple, the medium is a message means that content is important, but the context makes a difference. And now we live in a different context, and the context shapes the way we perceive reality, the way we perceive the world around us, the way we undertake our current affairs. And so, looking through different generations, media played a different role. And I see this difference. I see myself as raised with the TV like a babysitter, right? Mm-hmm. And TV was a kind of detaching medium because I was in front of the TV, right? My parents yelling, "Oh, you're in front of the TV all the time." Now, well, my students, younger generation, said, "I'm not in front of social media. I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook, on Instagram." That's a huge of a difference.
What does that convey, the difference in that preposition?
Convey that for my generation, media were tools, services, channels to get informed, to get engaged. For this generation, for the younger generation, it's a world they live in.
Here's how you summarize the current relationship among the different generations. You say silence and boomers are the powerful older siblings. Millennials and Gen Z are the energetic but misunderstood younger siblings. And Gen X, the middle child, is often forgotten. Okay, let's pick that apart. Why do millennials and Gen Z feel so misunderstood?
Well, I think all generations feel misunderstood by the others in one way or another. It's just a matter of, it's sometimes very hard to take the perspective of someone who is 20 years older or 20 years younger than you. And there's certainly a tradition of older generations trying to understand younger ones. And sometimes they fail and sometimes they succeed. I also think it needs to go both ways. I think there's a tendency for the young generation to dismiss the older generation as irrelevant. Sometimes they might be right, but not always. And I think that perspective taking is best when it goes both ways. That means the older generation has to hold back on criticizing sometimes. It means the younger generation also has to try to take the perspective of the older occasionally.
Given the divide between the older and the younger siblings, which generational values are shaping the future of one of the fundamentals of all of our lives, namely work?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting trends in terms of work attitudes. So I'll focus on Gen Z. So one thing that we see with Gen Z, and it's true of millennials as well, a lot of emphasis on work-life balance. So I don't want to work so much that I don't have things outside of work. Now, some older people see that as low work ethic. It's all a matter of perspective. The other piece is Gen Z is more likely to say that they want a job in which they can be directly helpful to other people. That's gone up in the big survey, say, of 18-year-olds in grade 12. So I think there's some opportunity here with the young adult generation now, with them really wanting to help.
Okay, Jean, let's talk some politics here, because you have suggested that a generation's political profile depends on, for example, how popular the president was during their lifetime. So let's go back. We can go back to the silence where Franklin Roosevelt was the president, and we can come all the way to present day where Gen Z had Donald Trump as the president, and of course, lots of presidents in between. Which generation did best on that front?
Well, I'm not sure it exactly works that way. I mean, what the research suggests is the party and popularity of the president when you're young tends to tilt you either right or left, Democrat or Republican in the U.S. So millennials, for example, tilt Democrat because Obama was relatively popular, especially, say, compared to Trump or Biden. So with Gen Z, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens because, yep, Trump wasn't popular. Biden isn't particularly popular either. So they've experienced both a Republican and a Democrat president who weren't particularly popular. So where their leanings will go in the long run is a little harder to say.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, June 9th, 2023. Monday, should Canada be more aggressive taxing wealth? Also, Canadian futurist Sinead Bovell on youth and technology in the age of artificial intelligence. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
With thousands of in-depth interviews and discussions, The Agenda's YouTube channel delivers context for virtually any topic you're interested in. Check out our latest videos and playlists at youtube.com/theagenda. And make sure to hit the subscribe button to get notified about all our new conversations. It's all available at youtube.com/theagenda.